Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Laura Camerlingo. I am the Associate Curator of Costume and Textile Arts with the museums and presenting curator of Patrick Kelly Runway of Love. I'm delighted to welcome you to the DeYoung for our closing celebration of Patrick Kelly. The exhibition officially closes tomorrow, April 24th, so please tell your friends, colleagues, loved ones about the exhibition and to see it before it travels. It will next go to the Peabody Essex Museum in Massachusetts. It will be on view from June through November. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please remember to silence your cell phones. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the talk, so also save your questions until the end. Today's program explores the influence, impact, and legacies of ballroom culture in Harlem and New York City, and artists who, like Patrick Kelly, were inspired by it. Indeed, Patrick Kelly's exuberant and now iconic runway shows borrow from elements of ballroom culture, as our speakers will today explore. I am honored to introduce our speakers. Born and raised in South Africa, Natasha Becker joined the museums in December 2020. Working in Cape Town and New York City over the past decade, she has focused on presenting the work of African artists, organizing numerous exhibitions and international initiatives. She worked at the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, as the assistant director for Mellon Initiatives. She also served as co-curator at the New Ford Foundation Center for Social Justice Art Gallery, curatorial advisor at the Face Foundation, curator in residence at Faction Art Projects in Harlem, and senior curator at the Goodman Gallery in South Africa. Natasha is one of the co-founders of Assembly Room, a curatorial platform for the advancement of women curators and artists in New York. She holds a master's in African history from the University of Western Cape, Cape Town, and she studied art history at Binghamton University in New York. As the curator of African art at the DeYoung, she is focused on bringing conversations to our historical collection, as well as expanding the presentation of contemporary African art at the museum. Rashaad Newsome's work blends several practices, including collage, sculpture, film, photography, music, computer programming, software engineering, community organizing, and performance to create an altogether new field. Using the diasporic traditions of improvisation, he pulls from the world of advertising, the internet, art history, and Black and queer culture to produce work that challenges the status quo and that walks the tightrope between social practice, abstraction, and intersectionality. Collage acts as a conceptual and technical method to construct a new cultural framework of power that does not find the oppression of others necessary. Newsome's work celebrates Black contributions to the art canon and creates innovative and inclusive forms of culture and media. His many honors and prestigious awards include a 2021 Knight Arts and Tech Fellowship, a 2020 and 2022 Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Artist Residency, a 2020 IBEAN Rapid Response Fellowship, and a 2019 LACMA Art and Technology Lab Grant, among many, many others. He lives and works between Brooklyn and Oakland, California. Please give them a warm welcome to the museum.
Test, test.
Test, test. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Laura, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Rashaad, for being here. Before we jump into our conversation with Rashaad, I just wanted to touch on Patrick Kelly and his involvement with the ballroom community in New York City in the 80s, because I think that from my reading, he was very much of his time, and his involvement in the ballroom scene was very much of its time, and a moment where the ballroom culture was becoming a mainstream American phenomena that was associated with fashion and celebrity and and was, very much defined by, Madonna's voguing, which she saw at a famous event called the Love Ball that was held in 1981 in New York City. And it was a fundraiser, an HIV/AIDS fundraiser. And it drew together this sort of fashion and, subcultural world of ballroom dancing uptown and downtown. And Patrick Kelly was a judge in these ballroom competitions, and he was also a sponsor of the Love Ball, the first one, which involved, people like Iman and Anna Wintour has famously said that she was disappointed that she wasn't invited as a judge to, the 1981 Love Ball. Also, given that the dance form voguing is seen as, a title that corresponds with the magazine Vogue, of course, and the popularization of Madonna's Vogue. But ballroom culture itself is much older than that and emerges in, the 1960s in Harlem, uptown, and has these different, permutations over time in the 60s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc. And Patrick Kelly, I think, represents a moment where Susan Sontag actually defined ballroom culture as being more closely associated with camp, and she defined some of the characteristics of camp as ironic, as, about parody, pastiche, naivety, duplicity, ambiguity, theatricality, extravagance, and also aestheticization. And I think with Patrick Kelly, when we see the exhibition upstairs, his designs, his models, and the way he posed them, and the playfulness and political character of his work seems to fit very much within this, tradition of camp. And at the time was less historicized within actually the Black community and the Latinx communities, out of which ballroom culture and voguing really emerged. And I think a lot of that history was, displaced in this mainstream popularization of Vogue as a dance form. And so today we are here with Rashaad Newsome, and it's a really, it's a little awkward to hold my microphone and my notes at the same time, but hopefully I won't, get it all mixed up here. And so while Patrick Kelly, I think, represents this, moment in the 80s and a particular, when a particular light was shone on ballroom culture. And, in 1990, there was the documentary film Paris is Burning that took its name from a very famous, legendary drag performer, Paris Dupree. And so moments, within which ballroom culture and the community came to mainstream attention. But like I said, there's this deeper culture that goes back decades before. And as many people within the ballroom community have mentioned, that this was never a passing trend or, something that was that they were waiting for mainstream culture for recognition, but that they were in fact defining and shaping their own culture. So this brings us to today's conversation with Rashaad, and who's our special guest. And I've known Rashaad's work for many years, and I've known his work to be bold and disruptive and celebratory, soulful and stirring, and deeply invested in honoring Black communities and Black experience. and also as an African art curator and historian, Rashaad and I have had, a deep connection around historical African artworks, and seeing them as also these, futuristic, almost like tools and devices and technologies for, navigating the world today. And so it's such a pleasure and an honor to have Rashaad with us today. We have a very special treat for everyone here in the audience today, in that we will get to see a sneak peek of an ongoing project. So this is a small 6-minute edit of a much larger project documentary film that Rashaad is producing with Johnny Simmons, and that will come out in the near future. But today, we get to see what he's been working on for a while, and also because I think it contextualizes where we are today, and where it contextualizes for us today what I think is really major differences between ballroom culture and the evolution of the community since the 60s through to the present. And so if we could have the film, oh, that is so moving. And I know the whole experience of assembly took was commissioned by the Park Avenue Armory in New York City, and it opened on February 16th.
Yes.
And then it closed in March 22nd. Is that right?
Yes.
You were in it, so.
I'm still kind of coming out of it. It was like a very beautiful fever dream that I'm still kind of trying to find my place in the world after that.
Well, we just watched 6 minutes of you, pulling things together that will be part of the documentary, Get Your Tens. But that is something completely different to the actual experience of assembly that you created, this multi-sensory, multi-complex experience involving, technology, performers, stage sets, sculpture, and just such an immersive, extraordinary experience within this cavernous space. And we see some slides of the, assembly in its various forms. But Rashaad, tell us where all this began for you. How did it all start? Your participation in and belonging to this ballroom community and this community of Black queer dancers.
Well, my kind of introduction to ballroom came from a party that I went to in the French Quarter many years ago, maybe in like the late 90s. I'm originally from New Orleans. And so, where I come from, there wasn't a ballroom community. It really comes from the East Coast. And I saw someone voguing, and then I was completely enamored with it. And then shortly after that, I saw the movie Paris is Burning, and I was like just really fascinated with it. And eventually I moved to New York. And when I moved to New York, I lived in a Black queer collective called Dumba. And it was started in the 90s by a documentary filmmaker named Scott Berry. And, over many years, the people who moved into the house sort of defined the house. So by the time I got to it, it was all Black and all queer. And I had a roommate who worked at a HIV and AIDS organization called GMHC. And they would do kind of like mini balls to kind of, because that was their way of kind of reaching youth in terms of their advocacy. And so we were living in this loft in Brooklyn, and so we had a certain amount of space, and so we were able to host some mini balls from them. And that was really sort of how I entered the community. And after that, I was just really enamored with it and tried to always attend balls as much as possible. And I became really close with a lot of people in the community. And I was always somewhat ballroom adjacent, though, because, I moved to New York to be an artist. And, I didn't have any family. I had no one. And so I had to work very hard all the time. And so it was really hard to kind of join a house because you got to go to the house meetings, you have to practice, you have to go to the balls, which was really late. And they go really late. And I would have to I was working from 9 in the morning to 9 at night sometimes. And so I went as much as possible, but I was also very laser focused on my career. But as I was sort of making my work and building my career, as much as I was showing and participating in institutions, ballroom to me was an institution that I always wanted to stay connected to because it was one of the few institutions indigenous to Black queer folk. And I think if I kind of think more critically about my connection to ballroom, I think it comes from my work, and so there's a long standing inquiry in the work is sort of the concept of Blackness and the aesthetics of Blackness as it is a construct that we have internalized as African Americans. And so that kind of I'm always trying to sort of make visible that immaterial practice because I'm also really interested in the performance of Blackness. And I think what draws me to ballroom is because ballroom is a space that is completely about the imagination and performance. It was a real generative space for me to kind of engage in that investigation, and that's why I kind of continue to go back to it. I'm also very inspired by just the practice of voguing, which came out of that community, which I think is one of the most extraordinary dance forms of the 20th century, in that it sort of functions like a programming language. There's, these 5 elements that make up the dance: hands, catwalk, floor performance, spin dips, and duck walking, which is sort of the binary code of the dance. But when you learn it, what kind of makes you stand out is that kind of connective tissue of how you bring those 5 words together in a sentence. And so sometimes that's modern, sometimes that's West African, sometimes that's ballet, Latin, whatever, And so it's very analogous to coding because if I learn it and I have a background in modern, and then I teach it to you and you have a background in West African, when you learn that West African is going to be in there, that modern is going to be in there because you're going to learn that from me. And then whoever learns it, they kind of get, so sort of like this tumbleweed that keeps growing and it's constantly in a state of flux. And there's not many dance forms like that. It's also completely improvisational, which I think is very connected to Black American experience. This whole idea of being inside of an idea and creating it in real time, and the improvisational aspects of that psychosis, that lived experience. So those are the things that kind of, I guess, keep me engaged in ballroom. Yeah.
And at what point did that cross over into your art practice?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like for a while the two were parallel,
Mm-hmm.
and that the ballroom community and the terms that the community is defined on, in each ballroom community has different houses, like you said, and then each house has its performances and its practices and its family, its own family, and so it is actually quite it has its own rules or for participation, and also it does operate like a family structure where the closer the closer the members are to each other, the better the performances, the tighter the community, etc. And I could see how for, young artists in New York City, that provided so much support. But at what point do they start to, do you start to see, oh, hey, this is art, and here you were exploring through abstraction, through collage, through sculpture, trying to dissect and to break down, as you said, the Black experience and what is Black aesthetics, and also I think trying to disrupt the conventional ideas about Blackness that even Black people may have about themselves, and then also expanding the narratives of art history and the canon of art by bringing, these different stories together. And maybe that's why collage is what had such an appeal to you, because it's also improvisational, it's as an art form, it is about taking fragments and creating a whole. And so I'm just curious at which point you sort of had this moment where life is art and art is life, and there's no, separation between the two.
Yeah, I think it kind of started with, I guess, like the first work that I would say really explicitly spoke to ballroom, particularly Vogue, was a piece that I did in 2008. It was called Untitled, and I did it with a performer, but also fashion designer, Shane Oliver, who is the creative director of Hood by Air. And I should say, too, I feel like the kind of resurgence of ballroom really is tied to the work that a certain cohort of people were doing in different spaces. So like me in the art space, Shane in the fashion space, Mike Q in the music space, and then just the ballroom community in the space of the internet, and the internet sort of like becoming a space where people can like skill share ideas, communicate globally. And I think all those things collectively really led to this kind of resurgence of ballroom and subsequently voguing. And so that first piece that I did with Shane was really, I shot him just freestyling. And, I don't have formal training in choreography. At the time, at least I didn't feel like that. And so I kind of went to the tool that I did know, the camera. And so I filmed him, I cut a piece together in post, and then I gave it to Shane to re-perform for the camera. And the final piece was, this sort of very intimate video of this performer dancing, no music, just this very intimate moment. It was really a way to kind of like introduce the audience to the beauty in the dance. I've always found that kind of like, that really kind of almost life or death kind of aspect of improvisation embedded in Vogue to be really exhilarating, as a person from, Louisiana, the birthplace of jazz, like that's something that I'm always really drawn to. And I see that in Vogue. And so I find that exhilarating. I also find like the narratives and shapes and lines that people create as they dance as really interesting. And when I see it, I always see like the lines and the shapes they're creating, and I always wanted to kind of visualize that. And so that kind of led to creating a technology that would allow me to do that. At the time, I was working on another piece, Shade Compositions, which was performed here in 2012 at SF MoMA. And the programming language I was using to create the tool I was using in that performance, I then used to start visualizing these shapes and lines that these dancers were creating. And that then led to a performance called Five, which premiered at the Whitney in 2010, where I had dancers come in and they performed live, and I visualized those lines. And it was also really connecting the work to that whole concept of jazz, because I was looking, it was sort of the early roots of assembly, and the whole idea, the whole title assembly kind of came from that work, and that I saw that kind of group of people in the piece as an assembly. You know, like I had, dancers who were responding to the performers in real time. And then I was motion tracking the dancers in real time. And so there was this kind of, the way I see it is like, the structure of the piece is also kind of dealing with the problems of creating work like that in historically counter-hegemonic spaces or hegemonic spaces. And so like it's set up in a cipher, which is very analogous to diasporic dance. It usually happens in a cipher. So I'm looking at the dancer, they're looking at me, the musicians, we're all looking towards the center and we're all improvising, essentially charging this dancer in the center with this improvisational energy. And as they're performing, you see this, form generated from what we're doing. And so that I think that's sort of like the trajectory of how I really started to bring that life experience I was having into the work, and just through that, it's just been continually generative.
And so, when you created Assembly, what was, because it sounds like, as you say, Assembly is this culmination of these different strands of your thinking and your work and your practice and your participation and involvement with the ballroom community. But when you were working on the commission, what was your process of working with dancers, and what were some of the challenges of producing such an epic, artwork really that involved so many different aspects, the AI being, the classes that you could sign up for on decolonization that was led by the being, as well as the, performance aspects, the choir, the dancers, the lights, and including the artwork. You also made new sculpture and collage for that as well. So I know you're still, reflecting and processing on that, and we got a little peek into some of, your process that I think also already shows how so much has changed since, the 90s, right? And when you were participating on a much more maybe micro granular level, but now with the internet and with this blossoming of voguing all over the world, that it's also opened up this whole, new arena that probably also comes with various, levels of complexities. So I'm just wondering, in terms of your process, like you could have worked with, let's say, just, New York City-based dancers, right? But you chose to make it about this global phenomenon too, and you're also working. I want to read this. I know you weren't reading any reviews of Assembly, but I want to read this little quote from the New York Times review on Assembly, which said, and I quote, "One of Rashaad Newsome's greatest contributions to contemporary art has been to highlight and champion voguing, a stylized form of dance invented by pioneers of Black and trans culture." And I think it's so important because it is about, as you said, voguing, in the realm of fashion, in the realm of dance, in these other realms, but in the realm of art, that the significance of bringing Assembly into the art space, I think can't be overstated, and so it has operated and been visible or invisible at various moments in different other spaces, but I think this is really one of like a significant change, like a kind of transformative, change in that history. And so I just wonder, what you were thinking about how it would be received within the space, and if that at all, was a concern for you, or if you really were, going into this space and like taking it on as a sort of way of also deconstructing art space, and also rethinking what art space could be.
there was a couple of questions in there. I'm trying. I was like, "Ooh."
Answer anyone you want. You could pick and choose.
Yeah, well, you asked about what were the challenges. I think some of the challenges were, I think more, they came from, well, I would say, you said what I was going into the space thinking about. What I was thinking about is care. Something that has always been a big part of my practice is like the process of care, the aesthetics of care, whether it be the objects that I use in my work, the way they communicate to folk, the people in my work, how I communicate to them, what we communicate to the audience. There's always a lot of care in the work that I make. And I think what came more into focus in the last couple of years around making Assembly is just like, also care for myself, in doing that work. And what was really at top of mind was creating this space that was like a fully healing space, from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, like sonically, everywhere you look, everything was healing. And I thought it was really critical when coming back from everything we've endured in the last 2 years. And so that was something I was really trying to create. And I was really lucky to work with the people that I work with because they all were completely in alignment with me on that. And I think part of what people responded to was the care that was put into creating a space that was a healing space. So like for instance, all of the projections were based on fractal geometry. But I was looking at fractal geometry from, African textiles, traditional hairstyles like braids, architecture. And so fractals as a geometry, many scientists have done research that those images, those animations are very soothing. And they reduce stress. Also, the kind of repetitious pattern of the vinyl running through the floor and on all the objects, that kind of repetition is also soothing. The sonic landscape that ran behind Being's voice was created with my lab at High at Stanford. We did a survey on with about over 80 Black folks, multi-generational, several different identities, and they were asked what were culturally specific sounds that folk found soothing, and then we used those sounds to compose that soundscape.
I remember that because I participated in the survey.
Yes, you did. Yeah, so I was going into it thinking about care. I think some of the challenges were trying to be vigilant about working that way. Sometimes there is not a lot of care working in spaces, but I do have to give a shout out to the Armory because I feel like they really were in alignment with me on that. And they really kind of made sure that I was given the space to create that kind of space. But, occasionally, something would pop up. You got your garden and a snake pops up and you chop the head off, so you just get it out immediately. And so I had to kind of really develop a kind of way of working where I had to really be like, this is a sacred space and anything that is not in alignment with it cannot be here. And that's where, when you see the cleansing of the space, like I cleansed that whole space. It was saged. I did some rituals that are from, my personal history, come from New Orleans, that really created a kind of container for the work to exist in. So that was, I think, kind of like one of the challenges is just, creating a space to do that. But then, I think, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think you addressed some of the, inspiration and motivations, but also some of the challenges. But I think the most important takeaway from what you just said for me is that when you set out, your intention, you set out to create a space of care and you establish some ground rules for that. And so, and you invited everyone into your sandbox and into your sacred space to play, but also to be respectful and to do it, to care for each other. And so I think you were very intentional about that. And, I think the survey and the thought that was put into every element certainly reflects that ethos and that practice. And I think that not only were you very intentioned about that, but you also, you've also done this deep research into the kinds of things that people would find soothing, but also digging into, Black experience and Black culture and queer culture for how safe spaces are created, where communities can care for each other, and it can be a refuge, and it can be a place of, joy or celebration or worship or, religion, etc. And I can definitely see how coming out of this 2 years and, the incredible violence and just the way in which the pandemic just exposed and revealed, ongoing racism and violence and inequalities, that to be in a space of the assembly and to be invited into that space and to experience that, it's quite a significant endeavor. I mean, looking at people speaking to being, and the kinds of questions that people are asking,
Yeah. Also, to go back to the object-based work that was in the space, even that was operational that way too. Like a lot of the images that I was creating had images of, a lot of the objects that we talk about all the time. Like you think, like for instance, like a Wakan Kalamar figure, which is often used in rituals to kind of conjure the dead from the spirit realm to help you in this realm. These are like old forms of technology that we have been sort of like disconnected from. So kind of putting that in the room with being and AI, this sort of new and old technologies there. And so what does it mean to kind of have an image that has pictures taken today of bodies that are under siege composed together with objects, images of objects from the spirit realm that call people from the spirit realm to help those bodies that are under siege, and then you put that in the room and invite those bodies in to kind of meditate, be still, be in fellowship. Those artworks then became more than just art objects, but almost like these talismans, that were there kind of to like hold the space in a way. And then being, to kind of even go further with that healing, what being was really doing is getting people to do what people are not doing, have difficult conversations so that we can transgress. And so, they would teach, people the 5 elements of Vogue and kind of frame the dance as a dance of liberation, but then offer a critical analysis of how the community that engendered the dance is not immune to internalizing, issues like white supremacy, patriarchy, capitalism, and how that plays out within the community to, get to a conversation about the importance of critical thinking, and kind of introduces the audience to, the incredible work of Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire, and then to go into mindfulness meditation so people can sort of think about what they learned, and then they're invited to, come back from the meditation and talk about how, these systems of domination show up in their lives and come up with an action step to free themselves or start to liberate themselves from that apparatus. And then in the end, just be in conversation with them so that it's not like, oh, here's this like AI that's gonna like help change my life, but rather we're all in this together trying to learn from each other and trying to go. Because being as an AI, typically an AI is trained in private, but this was a way to kind of actually train the AI in exhibition. And so the same way folks are learning about things that could help them transgress. Being is also learning from them on how they can communicate better and do the work that they've set out to do to help essentially human beings transgress even better.
Right. So a sort of two-way experience. But so does that mean that anybody can Vogue and anyone can join ballroom culture? I mean, it has become very popular around the world, and how does that make communities that have largely been Black and working class or Latinx and queer feel about this kind of mainstreaming outside of the assembly that you created? If we just zoom out a bit, because you also had dancers from Japan and Poland and West Africa and Brazil, etc. What is the conversation around around what, and also what I'm also intrigued by is what are different people bringing to the culture, that maybe not from the culture, and what is the conversation around that, around who is participating and how how it has become such a global phenomena. And I think assembly centers some very key and important and clear principles and values and communities. But I'm just wondering, from your own just communication and conversations, what is some of the concerns around?
Yeah, I think it's complicated because as an African American person, and you think about historically, our ancestors came here and they didn't have anything, right? Everything was sort of like taken away from them. They can only come here with what was in our nervous system, which is, I think, as a side note, what comes through in assembly, that immaterial kind of thing that I'm always trying to get at in my work. I think that was really coming through in assembly because it was really centering on that. But I think that kind of idea of like not having these, this clear ownership over things, because, not just Vogue, but diasporic dance in general has never been about like, oh, this is the person and like they are the icon of this. It's always been like collaborative and like everybody's participating in the creation of it. And so I think there is this kind of complicated thing with, obviously culture lacks fixed boundaries. Vogue should be able to be learned by everybody and it should be great. But how does that happen in a capitalist, imperialist, white supremacist patriarchy? It really complicates the ability for that to happen in a way that is not at the expense of certain people. And so, I don't know. I think that's what we're trying to get at in the film. We're asking a lot of those critical questions to folks that are coming into the community, folks that are there. I think for me, what is really important is that it become less of an extractive relationship to the culture, but rather one that is giving something to it. And that's what I was trying to get at with bringing these dancers in, is because I felt like these were all dancers from different parts of the globe that were very genuinely interested in Vogue, but they were also bringing something to it to sort of advance the dance. And, I know all these dancers very well, and they have a long commitment to studying the dance in a genuine way. And it wasn't sort of just like a fleeting interest.
Yeah, and I thought it's interesting that most of the dances, what it meant to them, it evolved around concepts of human dignity. It meant respect, it meant acceptance, it meant love, it meant things that are really about one's humanity. And I thought that was quite quite significant that those were that was the meaning that participation had. It was less about the politics, or the activism, but more about the way in which, the assembly created a space to be fully human and to, experience oneself in that way, in the highest form. which is not one's experience necessarily in the real world, you know. So before I open it up maybe for some questions from our audience, I wanted to just ask one last question that has to do with, you know, what it is that you hope a work like Assembly Room, you know, contributes to the ballroom community and the culture. What are your hopes for the film Get Your Tens? And I'd like to also know where the title comes from for the film Get Your Tens, because I was thinking about the fives and then I thought the film was the tens, and just wondered if there was, you know, a connection there. But yeah, just, you know, your greatest hopes for the work that you are doing.
I guess one of the hopes is like that the community starts. I have found in like making this work with and about the community for over a decade now that like often folk didn't see the cultural production. They didn't see the value in it in a certain way. Like it was fun and it was great, but they didn't sort of see the power embedded in it. That's kind of what I felt. And also I want to kind of go back to something that we talked about earlier. You talked about like sort of like what it means to bring it into the art space. And like, it's really great, but you know, I had a great experience at the Armory. It was great to do that piece there, but make no mistake, what made the piece great was not it being at the Armory, but it be like the Armory, but it being there. You know what I mean? And so like the work already is doing what it's supposed to do in the world. It's just that people are not, certain powers that be are not giving it the platform that it needs. And so it's really dangerous to think about the culture that we produce only having value when it's in white spaces. And that's, again, the interest in kind of always, you know, making work with the community in various different ways. To, you know, just as much as I'm in the D Young, you know, I'm doing the King of Arms Art Ball, like in public with the community. That's an institution too, you know.
Right.
So yeah, just hoping that people start to. I just love Black queer people, and so I just hope that people see themselves the way I see them. Yeah, I guess that's the hope.
And I think also, I mean, we as the audience, let's say, we also get to see, you know, through your eyes as the artist.
Yeah.
And I think that we get to see exactly what it is you see, in the sense of, you know, seeing humanity, seeing beauty, seeing empowerment, seeing love, seeing also a whole nother guidebook for living, you know, for interacting, like creating a whole other set of principles on which we can interact, you know. And I think that the classes and the workshops are part of that. We can learn to, you know, think differently, to behave differently, to create a different culture and society. And so I like the pedagogical aspect of it, you know, and that it is ongoing, the learning's ongoing, the AI is learning, you know, whomever is participating in the workshop is learning. But also how that learning and that experience can also happen through, you know, listening to the music and the choir and seeing the dancers and, you know, just actually becoming, by virtue of being there, one is part of the assembly, you know. And so I think that that's another powerful component of the assembly, is that, you know, here we also have a kind of map, and, you know, a map of how to care for ourselves and how to care for each other too.
I think that what you're describing, that kind of, when you ask like, what do I hope I do, like people being able to see the community the way I see them, and that kind of map that's being set out through doing that work. I think that is why you can have someone in Japan or someone in Poland connect to it that much and be like, oh, it, you know, Vogue told me how to be myself, how to, you know, love myself. You know, it's that kind of triumph of the human spirit that comes from, you know, a lived experience of Black queer people that I think is inspiring and kind of shows that like it is it's a human thing to want to be
Well,
and feel liberated.
yeah,
right?
and that movement can be transformative in that way. I mean, we know from, many African cultures, performative cultures, where the dancer dons a mask or a costume and becomes transformed and, performs to the good, for the good of that community. And once you take off the costume and, it's over, you go back into life, but you have experienced this transformative, moment. And I think that the focus on the dance itself captures that movement as in and of itself transformative,
And then hopefully the critical pedagogy you learn within the experience is something you can take with you outside of it to keep fighting the good fight. But the title comes from, like, in ballroom, like when you're going to compete at a ball, before you can actually compete, you have to do what's called get your tens. And so you go up and you perform whatever the category is, and then the judges give you your scores. And if you get tens across the board, then you're able to compete. And so I'm using that as sort of a proxy for just being like, like take up space, get your tens,
Love it. So, do we have a few questions? I think we have a microphone. If you just give it a second.
Sorry. This is super easy, I think. How many people were involved in assembly? How many people participated and came through?
It's you mean like just like the cast, or like the people behind the whole thing? Oh, I wouldn't.
Physically in that space over the 6 weeks.
Yeah, it was a massive amount of people. I mean, the cast was about, what was it? Like about 30, 40 people when you think about like musicians, vocalists, and stuff like that. But then, you have the people behind the scenes, people who are like running the sound, the lighting, who are also like on the team, and that becomes a much bigger. So I think it ended up being like, if I look at it from that number, is about 50 people. Yeah.
I know that attendance was packed. Every performance was packed, and you couldn't get tickets to, see it. And that, as you can see, it's a big cavernous space, and I'm sure the capacity was probably up to 200 people, I would say, right?
For the performances,
audience?
it was 300.
300.
And it was packed every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was very lucky to be able to see it, so thank you, Rashaad. But my immediate feeling when I experienced it after walking away was, how can I see more of this? Is the staging, which feels so tailored to the site, something that you have plans to do in other places? Is this something that can be seen and experienced here in San Francisco sometime soon? I would hope. But it really was an extraordinary experience of care and love. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It definitely will be touring. We're now working on that. The Armory is, their artistic director has a lot of roots in festivals in Europe, and so they're starting with that. But we're also definitely, I live in the Bay Area, so it will definitely come here. And at the moment, we're just kind of figuring out budget-wise what that looks like. But yeah, it is, it's kind of specific to New York, but it was a real crew of people, like we brought all those folks in from abroad. And so it could easily come to different cities. And in the spirit of, the whole concept of assembly, my plan is as it goes to different cities, it will kind of involve some new people in each place. Also, there's very few spaces like the Armory that can house such a project under one roof. And so also in the spirit of assembly, the form it will take in different cities is that it will be a sort of constellation of different institutions that work together to pull it off. So, like the performance might be in one space, the exhibition might be in another space, Being's classes might be in another space. So yeah, it'll change like that.
Hi, I've two questions. One, I was really taken by the beautiful patterning of the dancers' costumes and the wallpaper, and I just wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about your inspirations for that and how that all came together. My second question was, in the research on sounds that calmed people or made them be happy, did anyone answer Natasha's voice?
Well, you do have a very calming,
thank
soothing
you.
voice. Yeah, you do. Yeah, the pattern was created originally. I had been doing a body of work that was about the design formula of heraldry. And in that body of work, I was going through the process of actually becoming a herald, and the highest ranking officer of arms in heraldry is a king of arms. And so with that took the form of like a trilogy of videos and related object-based work. And when I created that pattern, it was to cover a car that would act as my float for a parade that I did in my hometown, New Orleans, when I was knighted to become a king of arms. And that imagery came from me thinking about still life. A lot of my collage work, they're images made of images. And so I often think about them not only as the picture that is composed that you see at the end, but also the concept of there being several things on a flat surface. So when I see them sometimes on my work table, if I was to not frame it and just photograph it, it's a still life, right? And so also one of a work that really spawned that print is currently on view at MOAD, part of a show called
Elegies.
Elegies. Mm-hmm. And when I was thinking about still life, I was thinking about this whole, like the idea of vanitas, memento mori, the kind of promise of death that unifies us. But the flowers that are in those images and that vinyl are jeweled flowers. They're not real. And so they're made of metal and stones, and so they cannot die. And I was really looking at that as sort of an allegory for voices that speak out against dehumanization, and how those voices have to be vigilant and can never die. That's why you often see, mouths speaking in the buds of all the flowers. And so it was really about kind of turning that idea of the promise of death into immortal life. So it originally was in those works, and then became a pattern that was used on that car that acted as the float. And then eventually I started to think about it as a sort of an armor. It became like a way to create a container for the work being in spaces that were somewhat problematic. The armory, it's the armory, right? I don't need to say any more than that.
It has its own history.
Yeah, and so I had to kind of think about what I could do to kind of deal with that problematic history. And so creating that container using that vinyl was a way to deal with it.
Yeah, both creating space and containing as well, because I think your work is about making space for Black voices, for queer voices, for really challenging issues that we don't want to. No one wants to talk about decolonization or colonization, for that matter. So I think it's also about creating a space, making space, and containing that space so that those challenging conversations, but also celebratory and kind of incredible experiences can happen within that space too. So I love how you bring that together. Do we have one more question up there? I'm not sure how we're doing for time.
Hi, thank you so much. I would love to hear more about the music that was performed live for Assembly, how things like the instrumentation was decided, if any parts of it were also improvisational, and how it interacted with the dance. And also on a separate question on the soundscapes and the survey that you did, I was curious whether there were things that came up in that survey that like came up again and again, or if there were any answers in that survey that surprised you.
Yeah, there was one that was consistent almost across the board. It was grease popping, like just kind of like grease on a stove, like frying something, that was almost everybody said that, which was, I don't know if it was surprising, but it was, it was a nice thing because it was affirming more than surprising, because if I did the survey myself, I would definitely say that. But in terms of the music that was performed live, I worked closely with an engineer in Minneapolis on some of the music, and the other, like a lot of the instrumentation. I worked also with I made some beats, but then I wanted it to be played live, and I don't have a background in sort of writing music, and so I would give the beat to someone to then transcribe into sheet music, and then the musicians then learn that, and that was a fun process too, because there was a way in which the music that we were creating didn't translate directly to instrument, and so there was like a way that we had to kind of retrofit that, and what happened in that process was really fun and exciting. And then, we were battling COVID the whole time too. And so that was another I didn't even say the challenges. Yeah, that was like a major challenge because, we created this bubble that was really working. And then eventually COVID crept in and it just started taking people out like one by one. And so I had to be really nimble. And although that kind of seemed really stressful, it also kind of gave a lot of freedom to really experiment. So like, for instance, in the performance, there were 7 acts. The first act kind of dealt with violence against Black trans women, who essentially, were the folks who really created the space of ballroom. So it was an homage to them. Then it kind of went into kind of spoken word, and was sort of dealing with continuing that theme, but also dealing with kind of homophobia. We went into the HIV and AIDS crisis, and how the effects that had on the Black queer community specifically, because so often when we hear about that history, it's really told through like a white male lens. And so we kind of dealt with that, and then it moved into joy, and really looking at the globalization of Vogue, like how, or not looking at it, introduced like the whole idea of Vogue being a kind of programming language, and what people were doing with it. And then it kind of ended with kind of this idea of like the fractal, the collectivity. And so like a lot of the imagery that was used in the show, we were trying to like visualize that through the dance. So it kind of moved a lot away from Vogue and went much more into, what you would call modern. But I kind of got off track.
The music.
The music, yeah.
I think if you want to hear some of the music, you can definitely find some clips on YouTube.
Yeah.
I checked, and it's
now I remember, because I wanted to, what was really exciting was in one act we had 4 different dancers from different countries showing these Vogue variants, and then one of them fell out, and so there was no cover for them because we brought them in from abroad, and so I had to come up with a cover, and there was this great moment where I was like, okay, New Orleans, and so I went to them. I was like, okay, let's create a new Vogue variant. And like one dancer was really amazing at J-set, which is a very like Southern sort of like step team kind of thing. And so we worked for a couple of days on that. And then I got on the mic and I was doing a lot of like bounce references, and I got with my drummer and he brought in second line drums, and my trumpet player, he brought in second line horn sounds, and you know, the costume team created like second line umbrellas, and we just like went with that. And so it was like, you know, the original setup was Japan, West Africa, particularly Senegal, Japan, Poland, and Brazil, and then it became the American Deep South, Poland, and Brazil. So yeah, we just.
So you improvised.
Yeah,
you went with the spirit of
Yeah.
of ballroom and collage and your own practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's
Thank you so much.
amazing. Thank you, everybody, and thank you so much, Rashaad Newsome, for being here and for, you know, giving us this opportunity to go really deep into your practice and into this particular new body of work. So this isn't the end of this beautiful experience and fellowship with different ballroom communities that Rashaad has shared with us. The film will be, you know, continue to be a work in progress and forthcoming. And we have assembly and we look forward to its different permutations. But there's also a video that I want to plug, which I absolutely love. It's called Build and Destroy. It was made recently, and it was actually shown at the Minnesota Street Art Project a couple months ago. But I think it's at the San Jose Museum now, right?
No, it premiered there.
It premiered there. Okay. So check that out because it's also this fantastic, incredible video piece that Rashaad created. And again, the soundtrack is amazing, and the words are really potent, and the message, you know, about empowerment is so spot on. So I encourage you all to look a little deeper into Rashaad's work, and I hope we will see you at the museum again in the future, Rashaad. Thank you so much
Yeah,
for
thanks
being
for
here.
having me.